The air at the Henderson County Implement Auction hung thick and heavy with the smells of cheap cigars, diesel exhaust, and desperation. It was the fall of 1974, and the scent of money was in the air, sharp and intoxicating as anhydrous ammonia. Men who'd spent their lives in BIB overalls were suddenly talking about futures markets and leverage, their faces flush with the promise of $5 corn. They walked with a swagger I hadn't seen before, their pockets full of banknotes signed by loan officers who were smiling a little too wide. I stood near the back, my hands shoved deep in the pockets of a worn denim jacket, feeling like a ghost at a feast. My name is Jack Miller. My farm, the 160 acres my grandfather broke with a team of mules, was a postage stamp compared to the empires being built around me. But it was mine. Every last fence post, every rusty nail in the barn, every clump of black Illinois soil. Paid for. That was a distinction that meant the world to me and absolutely nothing to anyone else. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Slim Perkins, whose voice could cut through the roar of a tractor pull, was working the crowd into a frenzy over the centerpiece of the sale, a brand-new John Deere 7700 combine. It sat there gleaming under the autumn sun, a monument of green and yellow steel. It had an air-conditioned cab with a tinted glass bubble, a 6-row corn head, and a grain tank big enough to swallow my whole harvest in one pass. It was the future, and the men gathered around it were bidding like their souls depended on it. I got 100,000. Now who'll give me 105, 105, gimme 105. Slim's voice crackled over the loudspeaker. A hand shot up. It belonged to Dale Evans. Of course it did. Dale was the poster boy for the new kind of farmer. He'd inherited a good piece of ground, just like I had. But where I saw a legacy to preserve, he saw a launch pad. He'd mortgaged his father's land to the hilt to buy the adjoining section, and he farmed it with a line of credit that would make a banker blush. He wore clean, pressed jeans to the auction and drove a new Ford pickup that hadn't seen a speck of mud. 105,000 from Mr. Evans, Slim bellowed. A man who knows progress when he sees it. Now who'll go 110? The crowd went quiet. That was a staggering sum of money, more than most of these farms were worth just a decade prior. Dale stood there, a smug little smile playing on his lips, his arms crossed over his chest. He scanned the crowd, his eyes daring anyone to challenge him. They landed on me, standing by an old, forgotten hay rake. His smile widened into a smirk. He sauntered over, his new boots crunching on the gravel. Well, well, Miller. You here to pick up a spare cotter pin? Or maybe you're looking to upgrade that museum piece you call a combine? I didn't rise to the bait. I just nodded. Dale. My combine was a Gleaner E, a 1967 model. It was small, loud, and had no cab to speak of. You sat out in the open, eating dust and chaff all day long. But its straight-through, center-line design was simple, and its little 4-cylinder Buda engine was as reliable as the sunrise. I could fix nearly anything on it with a set of wrenches and some baling wire. More importantly, I'd paid cash for it 5 years ago with money I'd saved from selling off a few head of cattle. You know, Jack, Dale said, leaning against the hay rake and lowering his voice so only I could hear, the bank president was asking about you, wondering why you're not expanding. Said he'd give you a great rate. There's never been a better time to get big. You're letting the world pass you by, sitting on that little plot of yours. It's embarrassing for the whole township, frankly. My father taught me a man sleeps better when he's not sleeping in the bank's bed, I said quietly. Dale laughed, a short, sharp bark. Your father also ploughed with a Farmall M and thought a 2-row picker was high-tech. This is a new age, Jack. It's about volume. It's about leverage. You use the bank's money to make your money. It's simple. He gestured back at the gleaming 7700. That machine right there will pay for itself in 2 seasons. 2 seasons. While you're out there choking on bean dust on that little orange toy, I'll be harvesting 3 times the acres in half the time, sitting in a climate-controlled cab, listening to the radio. Sold, Slim's voice boomed, the crack of the gavel sealing the deal. $105,000 to Dale Evans. Give the man a hand. A smattering of applause broke out. Dale gave me a final, pitying look. Think about it, Miller. Don't be a dinosaur. He turned and walked back toward his prize, the crowd parting for him like he was Moses. I watched him go, watched him sign the papers with a flourish, watched the other farmers clap him on the back. They saw a winner, a man of vision. I saw a man shackling himself to a mountain of debt, a debt that would only grow heavier with every tick of the interest rate. He wasn't buying a combine, he was buying a payment. A payment that would come due every month, rain or shine, high prices or low. I stayed until the crowd thinned, then I made my way over to the junk row. This was the part of the auction I came for, the forgotten tools, the piles of scrap iron, the cannibalized machines left for dead. I found what I was looking for, a pile of old sickle bar sections from a New Holland haybine, a box of assorted hydraulic fittings, and a heavy-duty gear puller with a stripped thread. I bought the whole lot for $12. As I loaded the rusty treasures into the bed of my old Chevy C20, I could hear the roar of Dale's new pickup tearing out of the parking lot, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. He was headed for the future. I was hauling home the past. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of what happened next, and how that pile of scrap became more valuable than Dale's brand new combine, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like that? A man who refused to take on debt, who insisted on fixing the old rather than buying the new, even when everyone around him called him a fool for it. Let me know down in the comments what you think of that kind of stubbornness, that old-fashioned way of thinking. Because that stubborn streak, that refusal to bow to the new gospel of debt, is the very heart of this story. The fall of '75 was a wet one. The rain started in late September and didn't seem to stop for a month. The fields turned to soup. Every farmer in the county was on edge, watching their crops stand in the field, watching the calendar pages turn. The new, heavy machines like Dale's 7700 were useless. They'd sink up to their axles in the mud, their big tires just churning the black soil into a bottomless quagmire. My little Gleaner E, however, was light. With its narrow tires and relatively small frame, it could float over ground that would swallow a bigger machine. I waited for a 2-day dry spell in late October when a stiff northwest wind firmed up the topsoil just enough. It was a gamble. The forecast called for more rain, but it was now or never. I fired up the old Buddha engine. It coughed to life in a cloud of blue smoke, then settled into its familiar, clattering idle. I engaged the header and the thresher, the whole machine vibrating with a sense of purpose. For the next 48 hours, I barely slept. I ran the machine from sunup to sundown and then kept going by the dim glow of its headlights, a lone light crawling across the dark, muddy fields. The work was brutal. Without a cab, the cold wind cut right through my jacket. Mud caked my boots and my jeans. My face was black with dirt and grease by the end of the first hour. But the machine ran. It ate the damp soybeans, spitting the stalks out the back and filling the small grain tank with golden beans. I'd dump on the go into my old grain wagon, pulled by my trusty John Deere 4020, its narrow front wheels cutting through the mud like a ship's prow. On the second afternoon, as I was finishing the last pass on my final field, I saw Dale Evans standing by the fence row. His massive combine was parked in his own field across the road, silent and clean, sunk in mud up to its hubs. He'd tried to go in and gotten hopelessly stuck. He just stood there watching me, his arms crossed. He wasn't smirking anymore. I finished the field, shut down the gleaner and climbed down, my body aching in places I didn't know I had. The silence of the prairie rushed in to replace the engine's roar. "Looks like you got yours done," Dale said, his voice flat. "Got lucky with the weather," I replied, not wanting to gloat. "It's not luck," he said, kicking at a clod of dirt. "It's that damn little machine. Who'd have thought?" He looked back at his own combine, a $100,000 lawn ornament. "Gonna cost me a fortune to get a wrecker out here to pull that thing out. And the crop, half of it's probably ruined by now." I just nodded. There was nothing to say. I had a bin full of beans, and he had a muddy field and a big bank payment coming due. That winter, the whispers at the co-op changed. They weren't calling me a dinosaur anymore. They were saying, "Did you hear Jack Miller got all his beans out before the snow?" There was a grudging respect in their voices, but it didn't last. The next year, 1976, was a perfect year for farming. A dry fall, high yields, and prices that stayed strong. Dale got his big combine out of the mud, harvested a bumper crop, and paid his bills. He bought another 80 acres. The memory of the wet harvest faded, and once again, he was the king. I was just quiet Jack Miller, the guy who got lucky once. My moment of vindication had been short-lived, but it had taught me something. My advantage wasn't just being debt-free, it was in the old ways, the old machines. They were nimble, they were simple, and I knew every inch of them. That knowledge was my real capital, and I was going to need it. In the summer of '77, as I was getting the gleaner ready for the wheat harvest, I heard it. A deep rhythmic grinding sound coming from the main cylinder. I shut it down immediately, my stomach twisting into a knot. I knew that sound. It was the sound of a main bearing starting to go. I spent the next 2 days tearing the machine apart. It was a greasy, knuckle-busting job. I had to pull the main drive belt, unbolt the cylinder housing, and use a chain hoist slung over a barn beam to lift the heavy cylinder assembly out of the combine. There it was. The rear bearing was shot. The cage had disintegrated and the rollers were scored and pitted. I took the old bearing down to the Alice Chalmers dealership in town. The parts manager, a young kid named Tim with a head full of part numbers for the new silver-cabbed models, just laughed. "A cylinder bearing for a Gleaner E," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Jack, we haven't stocked that part in 10 years. That thing's obsolete. You're lucky we even have the oil filter for it." "Can you order it?" I asked. He tapped a few keys on his new microfiche reader. He shook his head. "Nope, discontinued. No longer in production. You're out of luck. Maybe it's time you traded this old girl in for a new N-series. We've got some great financing deals right now." I walked out of there with a cold feeling in my gut. The wheat was turning golden in the fields. I had maybe a week, 10 days at most, before it was ripe. Without that bearing, my combine was just 3 tons of scrap iron, and my crop would rot in the field. Dale Evans drove by as I was leaving the dealership, giving me a little wave from the air-conditioned cab of his pickup. I knew by nightfall the whole county would know that Jack Miller's combine was down for the count. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my workshop, the dead bearing on the workbench in front of me, staring at it under the light of a single bare bulb. Giving up wasn't an option. Calling a custom harvester was too expensive and would feel like a surrender. There had to be a way. The answer, as it often was, lay in the past. I remembered old man Hemlock's place. Hemlock's farm was less of a farm and more of a mechanical graveyard. For 50 years, he'd never thrown a single piece of machinery away. When something broke, he'd drag it out to the back pasture and let it die. He had rows of rusted combines, tractors, balers, and plows, a silent army being slowly consumed by rust and prairie grass. He'd passed away a few years back, and his kids had sold the property, but the iron was still there. The next morning, I was at the gate to the old Hemlock place. I'd brought my tools, a heavy-duty puller, a rosebud torch tip for my acetylene rig, and a gallon of penetrating oil. I spent hours walking through that boneyard, the tall grass soaking my jeans. I found gleaners, but they were mostly newer models, cannibalized for parts. Then, tucked away behind a stand of cottonwood trees, I saw it. It was a Gleaner A, a model from the late 1950s. It was in terrible shape. Weeds grew right through the engine compartment, and a family of raccoons had made a home in the grain tank. But it was a direct ancestor of my Model E. I crawled underneath it, fighting through cobwebs and rust flakes. I got to the cylinder housing. It was a slightly different design, but the dimensions looked close. The bearing was the same diameter. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. Getting it out was a war. The bolts were rusted solid. I soaked them in penetrating oil, heated them cherry red with the torch until they smoked and sizzled. Then hit them with a 3/4-inch drive breaker bar with a long pipe on the handle for leverage. One by one, with a groan of protesting metal, they broke free. The bearing itself was fused to the shaft with 20 years of rust. I hooked up the gear puller, tightening the main bolt with all my strength until the puller's steel arms groaned. Nothing. I heated the outer race of the bearing with the torch, trying to expand it just enough. I tightened the puller again. This time, with a sound like a gunshot, the bearing broke loose from the shaft, flying across the underbelly of the old combine and landing in the dirt. I picked it up. It was caked in old, hardened grease, but when I wiped it clean, I could see the rollers. They were perfect. The steel was good old American-made Timken steel, forged to last. I had my part. Back in my workshop, I cleaned the bearing in a pan of gasoline until it shone. I measured it with my calipers. The outer diameter was identical. The inner diameter, however, was a few thousandths of an inch too small to fit on my cylinder shaft. It was from an older model, a slightly different spec. I was so close, I could have given up then. But my father's voice was in my head. If a man made it, a man can fix it. I chucked the bearing up in my old South Bend lathe, a machine almost as old as I was. With a freshly sharpened carbide bit, I took a whisper-thin shaving off the inner race. I measured. Another pass. I measured again. I polished the inside with emery cloth until it was smooth as glass. I packed it with high-temperature grease, the thick, dark red stuff that smelled like victory. It slid onto the shaft with a soft, satisfying hiss of perfectly machined tolerance. I reassembled the whole cylinder, torqued the bolts, and put the belts back on. By the time I was done, the sun was coming up. I'd been working for nearly 24 hours straight. My hands were cut and burned, my back was screaming, but the gleaner was whole again. I climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the Buddha engine fired right up. I engaged the thresher. Instead of a grinding protest, I heard the clean, healthy whir of a balanced cylinder and a happy bearing. I had done it. I had resurrected my machine with a ghost from a junkyard. The year 1977 turned out to be another banner year. Commodity prices were sky high, fueled by massive grain sales to the Soviet Union and rampant inflation. The mantra of "get big or get out" was preached from the pages of every farm journal and from the loan desk at every rural bank. Land prices in our county doubled, then doubled again. A farmer's net worth was on paper, tied up in the soaring value of his land, and the banks were happy to lend against that inflated value. Dale Evans was riding the crest of that wave like a champion. He used his profits from '76 and the increased value of his land to secure another massive loan. He bought out the old Henderson farm, another 320 acres that bordered his property to the south. To work that new ground, he bought a second big combine, an International Harvester 1480 axial flow, one of the first rotary machines in the county. He also bought a brand new four-wheel drive Steiger tractor. His operation was the envy of everyone. His yard was a showroom of new, powerful equipment. The lights on his machines could be seen from miles away, burning deep into the night as he raced to bring in a harvest that was now spread over 1,000 acres. He was a local hero. The farm papers did a story on him, calling him a progressive agriculturalist, a model for the future of farming. They took a picture of him standing in front of his new Steiger, his wife and 2 kids beside him, all of them smiling. Meanwhile, I had my own good year. My yields were strong, and the high prices meant I had more cash in my pocket than I'd ever had before. The temptation was there. The banker called me himself. He told me I was sitting on a gold mine. With my land paid for, I had immense borrowing power. "Jack," he'd said, his voice smooth as butter, "you could buy that quarter section next to you. We could finance a new combine, a bigger tractor. You're working too hard for what you're getting." I listened politely, and then I said no. Instead of buying more land or new iron, I took my profits and paid off the last remaining mortgage on the farmhouse itself. A small note my father had taken out years ago. I bought a new set of tires for the 4020. I replaced the sickle sections on the gleaner's header. And I put the rest of the money in a simple savings account, earning a measly 5% interest. In the eyes of the community, I had officially become a failure. I was the man who had been handed a golden opportunity and had been too scared, too backward to take it. At the diner, men would stop talking when I walked in. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and contempt. I was a relic, a man living in the past, stubbornly polishing his museum pieces while the rest of the world moved on. Dale Evans, on the other hand, was buying a boat. He was taking his family to Florida for the winter. He was a success. I ignored them. I knew my machines. I knew my land. And I knew the feel of a paid-in-full notice in my hand. While Dale was paying thousands of dollars a month in interest, my only bills were for fuel, seed, and taxes. I slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a man who owed nothing. But as the fall of 1977 bled into winter, a chill set in that had nothing to do with the weather. On the radio, the news was all about the oil crisis and runaway inflation. The price of everything was going up. Fuel, fertilizer, parts. And I saw something else, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. In the financial section of the newspaper, there was a small article about the Federal Reserve and its new chairman, a man named Paul Volcker. It talked about his plan to fight inflation by aggressively raising interest rates. Most people didn't pay it any mind. But I did. I sat at my kitchen table one night, looking at the bank statements. My 5% savings account seemed pathetic. But then I thought about Dale's loans. His were variable rate loans. I knew because the banker had offered me the same deal. They were cheap now, but they were tied to the prime rate. If that rate started to climb, his payments would explode. That winter was a mild one, but as the calendar turned over to 1978, the old-timers at the feed store started talking. They looked at the sky, at the behavior of the squirrels, at the thickness of the corn husks from the fall, and they shook their heads. "Gonna be a bad one," Old Man Peterson said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a coffee can. "A real gully washer. I ain't seen signs like this since '67. I didn't pay them much mind, but I did spend that winter in my shop, going over every piece of my equipment. I didn't just fix what was broken, I looked for what was going to break. I replaced hydraulic hoses that looked worn. I rewired the lights on my grain wagon. I rebuilt the carburetor on the 4020. I was fortifying my little kingdom, strengthening its walls, preparing for a siege I couldn't yet see." Out on the horizon, Dale Evans's new machine shed stood gleaming in the winter sun, filled with millions of dollars of iron. It looked like a fortress. But I knew it was a house of cards, built on the shifting sands of credit, waiting for a hard wind to blow. And the wind was starting to pick up. The old-timers were right. The winter of '77 turned into the blizzard of '78, a storm that would be spoken of in hushed tones for a generation. It didn't just snow, the sky fell down. A foot of snow, then another, driven sideways by a wind that screamed like a banshee out of the Dakotas. The world shrank to the walls of your own house. Drifts buried fence lines, swallowed cars, and rose to the eaves of barns. The county was paralyzed, locked in a frozen white silence. For 2 days, I did little more than keep the fire in the wood stove fed and make sure the pipes didn't freeze. My few head of cattle were safe in the old barn, 30 yards from the back door, sheltered and content. On the 3rd day, the wind died down and the sun came out, glittering on a landscape of alien beauty. The silence was absolute. No cars on the road, no sound but the groan of snow-laden branches. My first task was to start the 4020. It was an open station model, no fancy cab, but I'd had the foresight to plug in the block heater before the storm hit. I brushed a thick blanket of snow off the hood and seat, turned the key, and after a few slow, protesting churns, the old 6-cylinder diesel engine rumbled to life, its exhaust a column of white against the piercing blue sky. I dropped the blade on the front and spent the morning clearing a path to the barn, then digging out my driveway to the county road, which was itself an impassable wave of white. It was in the early afternoon when I saw him, a figure on a snowmobile moving slowly along the tops of the drifts where the fence line used to be. It was Dale Evans. He shut the machine off near my driveway and waded through the waist-deep snow toward me. His face, chapped raw by the wind, was a mask of exhaustion and fear. "Jack," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need help. Bad." He explained the situation. His main operation, including his big new machine shed, was on his home quarter, a mile down the road. But the 320 acres he'd bought from the Henderson place included a remote feedlot. He had 200 head of feeder cattle out there, with nothing but a windbreak and automatic waterers. The waterers would be frozen solid, and the cattle would be drifted in, starving and freezing. His new Steiger 4-wheel drive wouldn't start. The cold had gotten to its complex hydraulic systems, and his pickups were buried. "Can I borrow the 4020? He asked, the words costing him more than any $100,000 combine ever had. "It's the only thing in this township that's moving." I looked at my tractor, chugging away faithfully. It was my lifeline. But I looked at Dale's face and saw a man at the end of his rope. This wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. This was about a neighbor in trouble. "You can't get there from the road," I said. "The drifts are 20 feet deep in the ditches. We'll have to cut across the fields. I'll drive." We spent the rest of the day on that 40-20, a slow, grinding battle against the snow. The old tractor was magnificent. It wasn't fast or powerful by Dale's standards, but it was relentless. Its narrow tires cut down through the powder and found traction where his big flotation tires would have just spun. I chained up the rears, and we pushed our way through drift after drift, the diesel engine pulling with a deep, steady rhythm. We found his cattle huddled together, miserable and half-buried in snow. It took us hours with shovels to break them out. I used the tractor to haul round bales of hay from his barn, one at a time, creating a new feed line on a patch of ground the wind had scoured clean. We chopped ice on the water tanks until our arms ached. We lost a few calves, but we saved the herd. As the sun set, painting the endless snow in shades of orange and purple, we stood by the idling tractor, watching the cattle finally eating. "I owe you, Jack," Dale said, not looking at me. "I don't know how I'll repay you." "No charge for being a neighbor, Dale," I said. I looked at the old tractor, its green paint faded and chipped, its engine coated in a film of honest grease. It had done more that day than his $500,000 fleet of new iron combined. Sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. He just nodded, a silent admission that cracked the smug certainty he'd worn for years. The blizzard eventually melted, but something had melted in Dale too. The first cracks were showing in his empire of debt, not from the bank, but from the humbling power of a simple winter storm. That spring, the price of diesel fuel nearly doubled. The price of nitrogen fertilizer went up 30%. And on the evening news, they started talking about interest rates. A man named Volker was going to war with inflation, and farmers like Dale Evans were about to find themselves on the front lines, with no cover. The economic blizzard hit in the summer of 1980. It came not with snow and wind, but with thin white envelopes from the bank. The prime interest rate, which had been hovering around a manageable 8 or 9% when Dale built his empire, began to climb with terrifying speed. 12%, 15%, 18%. It finally peaked at a heart-stopping 21.5%. For me, it was an abstract number on the television news. My savings account was earning a bit more, which was nice, but I had no loans. The number on the screen had no power over me. For Dale, that number was a guillotine. His variable rate loans recalculated. His monthly payments didn't just go up, they metastasized. A payment that had been $5,000 a month became $15,000. The note on his land, his combines, his tractors, it all compounded into a monthly figure that was more than most men in our county made in a year. At the same time, the other hammer fell. President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. Just like that, our biggest customer was gone. The bottom fell out of the commodities market. Corn that had been $3 a bushel dropped to $2. Soybeans plummeted. Dale was caught in the perfect storm. His cost of borrowing had tripled while his income had been cut in half. The change in him was stark. The swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent, haunted look in his eyes. He lost weight. He stopped coming to the diner for coffee in the mornings. You'd see his new Ford pickup, now dusty and dented, parked at the end of a field, and he'd just be sitting inside staring. He started selling things off. The first to go was the boat, then a brand new planter he'd only used for one season. But the market was flooded. Every farmer with a big debt load was trying to sell equipment to raise cash. The auction yards were full of late-model, low-hour machines going for pennies on the dollar. The very iron that was supposed to be his salvation was now worthless. One afternoon, I was at the parts store looking for a new water pump for my Chevy. Dale was there at the counter. He was trying to buy a specific hydraulic sensor for his international combine. It was a small, complex piece of electronics, sealed in a plastic box. "That'll be $480, the young parts manager said. Dale flinched as if he'd been struck. $480? For that little thing? It's a dealer-only part, Dale. Got to come from the factory. Supply chain issues, you know." Dale stood there for a long moment, his hand on his wallet. I could see the calculation in his eyes. $480. That was a truck payment. That was a week's worth of groceries. He finally shook his head. I can't right now, just leave it. He turned and walked out, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I remembered my own desperate search for a bearing for the gleaner. The difference was, my solution was in a junkyard, pulled with a torch and my own 2 hands. His solution was a sealed box of wires that cost more than my first tractor, and without it, his $80,000 machine was dead in the water. He was a prisoner of his own progress. My farm, my little postage stamp, became an island of stability in a sea of chaos. My yields weren't as high as Dale's had been, but my costs were a fraction of his. When a hydraulic hose blew on the 4020, I didn't call a service truck with a $100 an hour mechanic. I drove to town, bought a new length of hose and 2 fittings for $20, and fixed it myself in half an hour. When the gleaner needed a new belt, I could find one at the local farm supply. My entire operation ran on parts you could buy off the shelf and fix with a wrench. By the fall of 1982, it was over for Dale. The bank, which had been so eager to lend him money just a few years before, was now ruthless. They called his notes, foreclosure notices were posted. The farm that had been in his family for 3 generations was going on the auction block. The empire had crumbled. The king was dethroned. The man who was going to own the county was about to lose everything. The day of the Evans Farm auction was grey and cold, a harsh November wind stripping the last stubborn leaves from the oak trees. It felt like a funeral. The same crowd that had gathered 8 years earlier to watch Dale triumphantly buy his new combine was now here to watch his world be dismantled piece by piece. But the mood was different. There was no excitement, no frenzy. Just a grim, sorrowful silence. We all knew it could have been any one of us. Slim Perkins was the auctioneer again, but his fast-talking patter had lost its edge. It sounded hollow, forced. He sold off the tools first, then the wagons, the planter, the big Steiger tractor. It went for less than a quarter of what Dale had paid for it. Then came the combines. The John Deere 7700, the one that had started it all, looked faded now. A long scratch ran down its side. It sold to a corporate farming outfit from out of state. Dale stood near the back of the crowd with his wife and kids, his face ashen. He wasn't the smug man I had known. He was a broken one. He was watching his father's legacy and his own dreams be sold to the highest bidder. Finally, Slim moved on to the land itself. "All right, folks," he said, his voice heavy. "Now for the real estate. We're selling the home quarter first. 160 acres, with the house, the barns, the machine shed, a fine piece of ground, a place to raise a family." My heart ached for them. This was the ultimate indignity, to be kicked out of your own home. The bidding started low. A few neighbors made half-hearted bids, trying to keep the price down. But the man from the corporate farm was there, his checkbook ready. He wanted the land. I had spent the last week at the bank. Not borrowing, but withdrawing. I took out every penny I had saved over the years. The money I'd made from good harvests and high prices, the money I hadn't spent on new iron or more land. It was a thick stack of cashier's checks in my coat pocket. When the bidding stalled, I raised my hand. "I have a bid from Jack Miller," Slim said, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. The corporate man immediately raised it. We went back and forth. The crowd was dead silent, watching. Every face was turned toward me and the stranger in the clean suit. This wasn't just about land anymore. This was about our community. Dale was staring at me now, his eyes wide with disbelief. The price climbed higher than the land was worth in that depressed market. But I didn't care. I wasn't buying an investment. I was buying a man's home. Finally, the corporate man shook his head and stepped back. "Sold," Slim Perkins yelled, and for the first time that day, his voice had some real feeling in it. He slammed the gavel down. "To Jack Miller." A wave of murmurs went through the crowd, then someone started clapping. Soon the whole crowd was applauding. Not for me, I think, but for the idea that one of our own had held the line. I walked over to Dale. He looked at me, his eyes wet with tears. "Jack." "Why?" "Your dad was a good man, Dale," I said quietly. "He helped my father get his cropping back in the flood of '59. Some debts don't get paid to a bank." I held out a piece of paper I'd had my lawyer draw up. This is a rental agreement. You're not going anywhere. You're going to run this place for me. We'll work it together. We'll get you back on your feet." He took the paper, his hand shaking. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a lifetime of pride and pain and gratitude welling up in his eyes. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Dale and I became partners. His knowledge of the new farming techniques, combined with my cautious, debt-averse philosophy, made a good team. We farmed my 160 and his old home quarter. We used my old equipment. The first thing we did was pull the engine out of his broken-down International combine and sell it for parts. We used the money to buy a used Gleaner L2, a slightly bigger version of my old machine, one we could both work on. The community changed too. The men at the co-op started asking my opinion. "Jack, what do you think of this new seed variety? Jack, you think prices are going up or down?" They had seen the flash and swagger of the new ways fail, and they had seen the quiet strength of the old ways endure. They didn't call me a dinosaur anymore. They called me for advice. Years passed. The farm crisis eased. Land prices slowly recovered. My son, Tom, grew up and decided he wanted to farm. He had my hands, the kind that understood machinery, but he had a better head for numbers than I ever did. One cool autumn afternoon, I found him in the workshop. He was in his 20s then, strong and full of ideas. He was looking at a brochure for a brand new combine. A massive gleaming red machine with GPS steering, yield monitors, and a price tag that looked like a telephone number. "Look at this, Dad," he said, his eyes shining. "It can harvest a 12-row swath. We could get our crop out in a third of the time." I walked over and stood beside him. I didn't get angry. I didn't lecture. I just put my hand on the familiar faded orange sheet metal of the old Gleaner E, which sat in the corner of the shop, retired but not forgotten. "That's a fine machine, son," I said, "a real marvel of engineering." I pointed to the old combine, "But let me tell you about this one. This machine taught me that being fast isn't the same as being ahead. It taught me that what you own is more important than what you owe. This old thresher, with a bearing I pulled out of a junkyard, saved our farm. It let me sleep at night. It let me help a neighbor. And it's the reason you have a farm to come home to at all." He looked from the glossy brochure to the old combine, then to me. And I saw in his eyes that he understood. He understood the legacy wasn't just in the black dirt of the fields, it was in the workshop. It was in the wisdom of knowing the difference between a tool and a trap. I'm an old man now, my hands are gnarled and my back aches when a storm is coming. Tom runs the farm and he does a fine job. He's bought some newer equipment, but it's always used, and it's always paid for in cash. Dale's son farms the Evans place now, and he and Tom often help each other out. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I walk out to the old machine shed. The Gleaner E is still there. I run my hand over its cool metal skin, and I can still smell the dust of 1,000 acres of soybeans. I can feel the vibration of the old Buddha engine. I can hear the whir of that junkyard bearing. It wasn't just a machine, it was a philosophy. It was a declaration of independence. In a world that screamed, more, bigger, faster, it was a quiet, stubborn whisper that said, enough. And enough, I've learned, is a beautiful thing. It's the sound of a harvest you get to keep.